I think we're live.
I think
Yes,
we're
indeed.
live. Nemo, welcome. Neil, welcome. Hello again. I'm Jeff, and
Thank
we're New World Chaos.
That's right. I'll be
And
new.
if it's the three of us again today, so if anybody is in the audience and wants to do the audience participation a little earlier, or come on earlier and be a guest wherever, just let me know in the comments or email jeffandnemo.com and we'll get you on. We have plenty of space today for guests.
Yeah. I'll be new today. Jeff, you be chaos, and Neil will be the world. The whole
Yeah,
world is
that
British
suits me
as of
fine.
now.
Nemo, the world.
Yeah. Well, Neil was kind of filling me in, Jeff, about kind of some of the things that are inspiring you guys these days and what you want to highlight in the world. And what I got out of it is a paraphrasing of what Neil told me is be emphasizing something positive, personal, and proactive. It's like taking
Yeah,
what we've been through in the world and what do we want to do with this? Like, what on earth? Like, that's like, it's almost like it brings the question up to me. What do you want to do with this? It's like you're handed something random, confusing, chaotic, nonsensical. Say, well, what do I do with this?
You mean the podcast specifically, or the
Nah, not
community?
necessarily. No, I mean just life. I mean, my
Oh,
life has been getting like growing more entropy in it. It just seems to like the roller coaster gets more exaggerated as it goes along. The more I try to do good things. So I've
well,
decided to go off in a completely different direction. See what
tell
happens.
us about it. You just had a little adventure yourself. Speaking of which,
Yeah, I literally just got back from more chaos. I'm putting myself through these nuts things as I'm trying to do something where I think I must be going against the, sounds dramatic, the forces of nature. Like the more I continue in life, the more the things I'm trying to do and build on seem to be conflicting with what most people are doing. But I just got back from a flight from Atlanta, second round two of trying to get this camper van across the country. We got 100 miles. We broke down again. We got towed 60 miles. We got stuck at the towing company in a town called Macon, Georgia. Felt like we were in the middle of nowhere, but it was a big nowhere, I guess. And all these repair shops that specialize in vans and things like that are backed out a lot. So I'm back here now. And the van is going to get towed to this specialty shop kind of by Atlanta. And it's going to sit there for a month and then hopefully it can get repaired. But it's weird because with the theme today, this actually is kind of related. I think van life is becoming extremely popular. Like it has been, and alternative ways of living and like housing have been really popular the last 10 years, I think, as a response to the housing crisis, at least in the US. And van life is part of that. And I think it's there's a second wave since 2020. So now it's becoming even more popular. And all the industry surrounding it is completely overwhelmed. And so I'm starting to figure out that people are hitting roadblocks in so many ways on traditional paths that they're trying to circumnavigate around it and go to an alternate. And so those alternates aren't built up enough yet to take in these floods of people. But I want to tap into that. I want to get into it and see if I can do something in an alternate sense, as mainstream stuff is not working out for me.
So what inspired you to kind of go with the van, and what's your sort of vision of what that might look like?
Well, I noticed that this is really strange to me, given that van life is relatively popular and renovating and like designing custom vans is pretty popular to do that kind of a thing, conversion vans, etc. Yet it for how popular it is, it doesn't seem like there are innovators and creative, entrepreneurial minded people hopping onto that industry. It seems like they're really far behind. It's like catch up. And my thinking was, so there are some companies and individuals and websites and apps where you can rent out a camper van as if you're going on vacation. That's what it's built for. So it's really, and we're renting it as a vehicle, kind of a vacation vehicle. I would want to rent them out as if I'm a landlord. So structuring it so that it's meeting people's housing needs rather than assuming they're renting it as a vehicle. So it actually fits the situation better. There's all of these people that are in between situations. There's a lot of people, I used to work in these industries with homelessness, housing, and youth issues. There's a lot of people that get close to that line of becoming homeless, but don't. This is actually pretty common. There's a lot of fluctuation, then there's periods of instability. There's a lot of people in gray areas. And with the issues culturally, and you could say politically, in homeless nonprofits right now, you have to be in as bad of a situation as possible from their standards to actually get help. So I want to help prevent those issues and intervene and fill in some of the gaps. That's one possibility, at least as I see it.
It does sound like a kind of nascent industry, something that's like on the edge of birth, so to speak. So there's what you've described is that in terms of the sort of renovation and maintenance of vehicles, that's backed up. So there is a demand for that there, but it might not yet have formed. You said like maybe it's lacking some entrepreneurship. So there's like a space there for that to happen. And so if I'm like imagining forward that these things have started to come together, so what sort of positive benefits do you think that would bring to community in America? Would that form new communities? Like, what would that kind of look like? Because it sounds quite exciting.
Well, fingers crossed. I actually think this has already been happening for a pretty long time in the US. If I want to trace it back as far as I think is relevant, I would go to the kind of hippie revolution in the 60s. And it's just becoming more obvious. And I think every time we get new issues that come up that cause these major changes, culturally, economically, more people understand some of the off-grid, more hippie, on-the-road lifestyle. It's sort of a wanderer. It's like being a wanderer. Or you can even think of the hero's journey in a sense that a person gets woken up and their world's shaken up, and then it kind of makes them homeless for a while, if you want to speak metaphorically, or maybe even literally, and they're turned into a wanderer. And so it's this exploration that happens when you're groundless. Your previous context is maybe rigid, it's old, it's outdated, or it's falling apart. So there's all these people that are wandering, and to some extent, I don't know if they always find what they're grasping for. Sometimes it can take a really long time. I already see communities having formed and forming. I honestly think that in some ways, that development, some people are resisting it or they're behind. And so I can only imagine that camper van communities are going to be a really big thing moving forward. I mean, so many major cities have these huge issues politically, economically right now in the US. So if people can make use of rural areas and they find each other and they have a sense of community and and their homes are movable and they can just stick it on some land somewhere, I think that opens up really remarkable opportunities.
Yeah, go ahead, Neil.
So go on, Jeff.
I was gonna say there are my dad and my stepmom, when they retired, they bought an RV and they did the RV lifestyle, and they found these little RV communities. They're like, I get parks where you all park your RVs together and you stay for months and you get to know each other, and they travel with the same people throughout the years. So I know that there are at least these RV communities that retirees form. So it'd be very easy to transfer that to camper vans.
And so what's the difference between an RV and a camper van for
our purposes? Probably nothing. It's just a mobile. It's a place to sleep and travel. I've been parked for over a year. I think the pandemic all kind of has us in that state you described right now to one degree or another. And I've been parked for over a year. So my nomad instincts are definitely active right now. And I can see taking some time to wander and travel for a while.
Yep. Well, a lot of the work I'm getting into now, there's the phrase, if you can't beat them, you join them. Well,
if you can, what do you do if you can't join them?
Yeah. So, I keep getting ostracized. That's my whole deal. I've talked about those things plenty of times. People can imagine the rest if they like, but it's, for me, I'm continuing to go alternate routes. When I got into youth work, that was already an alternate route away from the school system and away from, say, I don't know, government, like Child Protective Services. So I found an alternate way that I thought better served the type of work I wanted to do, and that I hit another roadblock. And so I have to go more alternate. And so I need to do a lot of investigative work. And that theme of investigation and exposing things to the light that people don't yet see, I think is a really powerful and relevant theme right now across many, many different contexts. And so I don't remember why that came up, but I don't know. Jeff, you said something that reminded me of it, something about your nomad stuff. So if we're traveling around in the camper van, I think we're going to get to see what's actually happening on the streets locally, personally, in a lot of places. And right now, the internet seems to be obscuring more than it is clarifying for a lot of people, like how they use it. So I want to just get back to being in person as much as I can and see what's actually out there. And I want to see it kind of in depth. And I think a lot of people, it's almost like they're stereotyping themselves. They just go along with the same old assumptions of, well, this is what and how and who I am. So obviously this is what I should do or believe.
I want to see it too. Why don't we? I'm serious. We can chronicle the new America, like the post-COVID America, and go do a survey and broadcast it using the podcast and the Zoom.
Yeah.
I think we should seriously talk about doing it soon. In fact, a month sounds so far away all of a sudden.
I'd like to hear more about your nomad life, Jeff, as well, like where that comes from and where that goes to.
I don't know. I've been nomading since I was like forever. Probably even as a teenager, I would take off here and there. And maybe culturally, I grew up very rural. We ran outside and explored and played, and we had some woods. We wandered in the woods, and we were free range, so we were constantly exploring. And I used to take off with friends on road trips. I moved to Austin when I was 20. A friend of mine was moving to Austin. She stopped by the house to tell me bye, and I hopped in the car with her and took off with her to Austin that day. I did not know I'd be doing that when I woke up that morning, and I stayed for 8 or 9 months. So I've I don't know how to explain it. If nothing's happening where I am, or I'm not stimulated, or there's nothing going, I have no problem going off and exploring. I'm a hiker, a camper. I love to backpack. I love to go on long trips for days and days at a time, just wandering and exploring. I love meeting people. So the idea of getting to meet people from all over the country excites me. We can give a little window into what's happening in each part of the United States.
Yeah.
In fact, if we keep talking about it, I'm not going to be able to do the podcast today because I'm so excited. My mind is spinning right now.
I think you should tap into the excitement.
Maybe we could rent a vehicle and do a little practice launch to get the technology worked out and everything.
Well, I got to tell you, Jeff, and for any of our listeners that want to know what it's like to try and get yourself a camper van and do van life, it's very expensive. My situation has been very expensive. I've never seen that much money leave behind and fly away just to get this thing repaired. And I told the first place on our first trip, we did a trip down there a month ago to get the thing and get it repaired. And I thought I told them do a thorough, complete everything inspection. And here I am again. And so I'm honestly realizing that if I want to make some generalized economic statements that I still think are useful, There's a lot of areas where the pressure is really intense, like the weight of the problems that we're facing are really weighing down on certain people in particular positions. As I think it's actually weighing down pretty heavily on landlords. I've seen some landlords basically be in complete ruins because of the eviction bans in certain major cities being so extreme, while their tenants are basically squatters. It's like their government's saying, take over the house or the building. And it's really hard on people. And so like the van stuff, it means taking on an incredible amount of responsibility with a type of goal that is really challenging and requires a lot of creative, strategic decision making. And so I think most people, if they were put in the situations I was these last two times, where you're trying to repair this thing, you have a time limit where you have to be home. You were expecting to drive it across the country, like almost 1,400 miles. We had to drive it from Georgia to Minnesota, and it breaks down, and you haven't even gotten anywhere near the Georgia state line. And it's expensive, and you have to find specialists in a place where I don't even know Georgia that well, but I've probably called dozens of specialty repair, mechanic, towing company, blah, 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 you name it. And you're going in blind with these things. In a weird sense, I almost thrive doing that. I'm really good at improvising. And when something really challenging comes at me, I go at it hard, and I go at it immediately and with creativity. And that's what I do. But even with that, the best I've been able to do is not screw up my life and get the van to a place where it can be and be repaired, if I'm lucky. So these things that we're being pushed towards are really challenging, and to a lot of people probably would seem impossible to try and solve these problems. But I almost ironically take it as a good sign. In my experience as a youth mentor and working with vulnerable populations in really rough conditions, when you're buffered from that really intense challenge and you don't feel it and life is just comfortable and rigid, then that's a sign that you're trapped. And as soon as you can find a way you're exploring and all of a sudden you hit something really tough, where the only thing you can do is use every ounce of your creativity and survive and fight through it, that's actually a sign you're in the right place, unless you don't want to achieve that goal. And that's kind of what I'm processing right now.
It sounds like anti-fragility. It sounds like the meeting of challenge that makes you stronger, which is a really good quality for people to develop. It also does sound like a huge opportunity in terms of, like, I was starting to imagine a kind of network of not necessarily registered, but sort of like validated or accredited repair shops, tow shops across the country that could help a community function, and people sharing their experiences of that, so that the sort of network of reliable people grows and gets shared, and that in itself then starts to kind of snowball, and you'll start to get people sharing their experiences of good quality repair, of good quality tow places, of where you can get good water and good electricity supplies.
I was thinking along the same thing. If this is you meeting challenges alone as just one person, imagine what you could do if there was a community of people like you all supporting each other when they needed it to meet their challenges.
It would be incredible. I've never really had that. That's been the thing I've struggled with the most. If we're talking through the lens of self-determination, I fought for my autonomy, and I got it basically overnight when I was a teenager, and I got out of my parents' house. And from there, I naturally became a lot more competent, because you're grappling with life as it is head on directly. And it's the interconnection piece, relationships, that has been the biggest challenge. And I think what I've really noticed is that most people will sacrifice some degree of autonomy and some degree of competence so they can have relationships. Like if you've had a crappy job, a lot of times the managers are making really dumb decisions, or they're micromanaging. So you really can't be the best you can at that job, because you're lacking autonomy. So it hinders your competence. And maybe you are highly competent, but it certainly hinders you from being able to show that in a way that actually has an impact. So I think that's a timeless struggle with people, is to find a way where these three needs, autonomy, competence, interconnection, can all be met symbiotically, where they work together, they connect together, they overlap. They're in congruence, they're in alignment, they're not in conflict, at odds with each other. And I think a lot of people in my life are probably provoked by me because those needs are in incongruence, in conflict for them. And what I'm presenting would be this painful process of reforming so that they can be in alignment.
I think it's quite natural to have that sort of compromise between autonomy and relationship. And I think at times it might be necessary to give up more of one in favor of the other, at least in sort of the learning stage of kind of understanding how and why that works. For me personally, I have this sort of like vision of people that have very strong autonomy and self-determination forming communities. And my question to myself is, how does that compromise, if it even, does it have to be a compromise, is my first question. But how does it work, basically? Like, how does it start to fit together? And what do kind of like groups of autonomous people look like together? I think is a really, really interesting question. And but I also think I think over time we've learned to believe that it's necessary to make maybe big compromises, but I think that's just a learned thing. I don't think it's like an inherently natural law or order, like that it has to be that way. So I think it just takes being a little bit courageous and exploring different ways of doing things, really. So that, for me personally, like, actually, I've got quite a good personal example. So I started learning martial arts when I was very young. And one of the key things in martial arts is self-discipline. But a second element of martial arts is about having a deep level of respect for the other people that you're involved with. So in terms of practicing and competing in martial arts, you're actually in combat with another person, but it's done based in like a code of honor. And I don't mean that to be sort of like some militaristic thing, but actually just as a deep level of respect for the other person and their autonomy and their individuality, but sharing what becomes shared, what builds the community, is an agreement about how you interact with each other. One that's based in strong values, respect for self and respect for each other. So then it goes from being compromised to more towards that alignment that you spoke of. So that was just one example of learning to do that through martial arts, but I'm learning to do that also through therapeutic practice, through hanging out with you guys, through hanging out on the Discord and talking to people that have different opinions. But if I keep referring to myself about self-respect, respect for the other, and I find the alignment easier and easier and easier, to the point where I'm having conversations with people that have very different perspectives from me, very different upbringings, whose views I would normally say I would have said I was opposed to in the past. But now I'm actually finding, if I just look at them with respect, that they just come from a different place, the conversation changes. It changes very naturally and without any real need to direct it. And I've been building some really amazing friendships with people that, say 10 years ago, I would have just not even given them a minute. I just wouldn't have even tried, or I would have swerved it, or I would have compromised myself, or I would have expected them to compromise themselves. And I don't find it's necessary, for me personally. So that's where I'm going. I'm continuing on this self-exploration of determining what my values are, how I hold a lot of self-respect, how I build that, how I've discovered the things in myself that compromise that. So how do I compromise myself, actually, is a really good question that I'm trying to explore. And as so, for example, like, I don't always do what I feel is right, but I'm learning to try to to honor what I feel is right, but to do that in a way that's respectful to anyone I'm communicating or interacting with. And that is really transformative for me. And I hope my vision of community is towards that somehow. I feel like I need to do it for myself so that I can live it for others as a kind of, to model it, so to speak, just kind of like model the way I would want to be with other people. And I hope that that way can also develop new types of relationships or new types of community. So that's my little ramble.
Oh, that was a good ramble. I was telling a friend the other day that this what we're doing in that kind of the anti-woke movement reminds me of the gay thing growing up. Like, you realized that you were different inside, you felt differently, thought differently, you had different internal values than the people around you that you couldn't change, and you found other people that shared those values, and you formed a community based on those values. And that's kind of what's happening with us and the people that are being peeled away from their communities. They're becoming aware of a difference in themselves, in contrast to their social group or the people around them, and it's driving them to find other people with that similar awareness or difference, and forming those communities. Like in the gay world, one of the big values was merit. We wanted the ability to form our own relationships, and marriage was a big value. So we organized around that. We fought for that. So I think values like that will emerge from whatever this counter movement is. And eventually it'll clarify into something that we can all unite behind concretely. But in the meantime, just finding other people that have the same, or having the same kind of inner or subjective experience right now with what's going on in the world, and continuing to grow that. That's why gay bars were so useful back then. And I wish that, I've said this about the autism community, I wish the autism community had autism bars or coffee shops. I think it would help them progress in their organization. But something like that for us too now. Like, we need like classical liberal coffee shops or classical liberal bars, or we have the Zoom and the Discords and the communities right now as a start. But something like that to help the organization and the community grow, and the values that it's growing around to come into view and kind of sift out and be determined.
Yes.
It sounds
Amen.
like a migration from, sorry, go ahead, Levi.
Well, Jeff's description here reminds me of something in Jordan Peterson's new book towards the beginning. He's describing how important it is for people to have conversations regularly, that it helps you process what's going on in your mind in the real world. And so you're working it out, and it becomes refined and it clarifies. And so it's almost as if you're able to sense and perceive what reality is and how it's changing and what's happening. And with a lot of isolation, people don't really get that like they did in times past. And I'm noticing in all the areas where I want to point to serious major problems, it's too easy for people in the middle of those issues, who often perpetuate them, to recognize what I'm pointing to because it's not well defined. Or there's areas where it's incredibly vague or not defined at all, not even pointed to. There's just the culture, and people use that deliberately to obscure the terrible things they want to do. And so if we can have places where people are able to come together and just interact with each other and see what actually happens in real time, you know, it's a risk, it's vulnerable. You don't know what's going to happen if you decide to have a real conversation. Every conversation that's authentic and not a speech prepared ahead of time is improvisation. We do it all the time. And there's something really powerful in that, where you don't know what's going to happen. It keeps you on your toes. You can't really be fake and BS your way through something if it's not pre-planned, or if you're not just falling into the same rut, just going through the motions and doing it the same old way. So if we had those types of environments, as Jeff is describing, really it's a third space or an agora, those like open-ended meeting grounds, then this would be really radical. That would be pretty much an essential pillar to this economic and cultural revolution, if you ask me.
Well, we do have them. We have them on Zoom. We have them Discord. So we have technological versions of them. We just need to get more people to use them, and we can expand into the real world community. I think that would be very easy to do.
That's what I was going to ask about. What do you imagine in the future that that transition from the digital third space into the physical third space?
I'm thinking of something like Meetup.
Imagine like I was just
I used to be
just
a
imagine
Meetup.
like coffee shops into bars. Like I really liked that little sort of analogy or actual reality that, you know, I just imagining sort of like something daytime's a coffee shop and a cafe, evening, nighttime maybe a bar, but it has this running theme of openness and some kind of like agreement on how people interact with each other in just a way to frame open conversation and exploring difference.
My dream for a long time was to open a coffee shop for people that are weird and different, like creative people, autistic people, peers, mental health people. And during the pandemic through Zoom, I got to finally do a version of that and get a taste of what that would be like. And I loved it. It's absolutely the right thing to do. I used to be a meetup organizer, and I'm thinking of something like Meetup, where you don't have to have your actual physical space. You just adopt an existing restaurant or coffee shop, or you find a place in the community to meet at, and you organize it and coordinate it through some kind of calendar or website or event function. And then you can have the Zoom community, the Discord, because that connects the people from all the parts of the world. We're not in the same geographical area, so we still need a way for our community to continue. But then you can have local events at a bar or a coffee shop, and I can help with all that because I know how to talk to the restaurant owners and organize an event and get their cooperation and all that. So I can help start to kind of establish that on the ground footprint, but it's very easy to do. It would just need a few volunteers from each city to kind of start creating a little network there, finding a few places they can have events, getting those events set up, and finding ways to draw in more local people from there.
What about a camper van coffee shop we take on the road?
I love it.
And we live stream from it, hanging out with people.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, I'm down. This has turned into Jeff and Nemo and Neil's innovation happy hour.
And I guess if anybody else wants to hop on with this, there's a few people in the comments. You're welcome to. You can email us for a link. We'd love to add new voices to the conversation today.
Yeah, I really like this sort of where this is going, because I remember maybe a few episodes back, the sort of talking about self-employment, and something. This is just coming to my mind as I'm speaking, so I might get a bit garbled, but I hope to be clear. But I was just sort of thinking about how these types of communities and spaces, you know, where people have a need for something that would normally be satisfied by a commercial enterprise of some type, how that maybe then be able to be satisfied by someone else within the community. So there's actually generating economic exchange. And I mean, just as a really simple example, if you said a couple of people in an RV or a camper van community that were good mechanics, like they basically got a business there. You've got people that are, you know, that are you know, running food shops or whatever. You've got another community there, but that can run through all sorts of different things, through design, art, creativity, clothing, lawyers, therapists, all types of services. I mean, you've got people that, just because you may have a particular career type history or career aspiration, it doesn't necessarily have to be rooted in the sort of model of house, office, fixed location. Like, I don't see that having to be the case. I think those services, and I think, you know, outside of like manufacturing, which obviously needs a kind of, for most needs a kind of physical base, especially if you've got machines, but for many other things that people do, there really isn't a need necessarily for it to be in a fixed location. And all being connected to a specific organization in terms of like a commercial organization. I think there's opportunities for people in the future as these communities grow to create businesses with each other as well. Not just independently, but actually start to form businesses that require 10, 15 different people to work together. And I've noticed that one thing during this pandemic has taught me is that before this pandemic, whenever people that I worked with said, I'd like to work from home, say on Wednesday, you know, I need to work from home. And our bosses would generally be like, well, I really don't know about that. And it was a trust issue. It was, I can't see whether you're working, so I don't know whether it's okay for you to work at home. And then this pandemic has forced the situation where people have to work from home. And the outcome has been higher productivity, at least within my sector. Like, it's been much higher productivity. And we've started to talk about what would it be like to go back to the office. And everybody said, but I work better from home. I can focus better. There's less interruption. It allows me to do my work. And to my surprise, our management have turned around and said, well, your productivity is higher. This works better. And it wasn't expected. And the whole trust issue is gone. They trust us. And that in itself has made us feel like a better team. So we have much better relationships. And those relationships are rooted in trust. And that trust is demonstrated through productivity. And there is the trust issue is dissolving, the relationships are stronger, and the outcomes for the organization are better. And that has been, like, maybe for me, one of the most positive things that's come out of this. That could go mobile. Like, with technology, that you don't even need to be I don't need to be in a house. I could be in a van. I could be in another country. Could be at the top of well, maybe not the top of a mountain, because you may have Wi-Fi issues, but
no, you can
you get my drift, right? Like,
with Wi-Fi.
Well, okay, so maybe that is also
they used to hike, and then we'd reach the top of the mountain, and they'd whip out their cell phones, and they'd start getting their signal, and it was so surreal.
That's wild.
So I'd love to hear from other people how they would feel about that, whether that's something that people would want to engage.
I've been saying what you said. Like, I think this hybrid virtual real life community network, and we need the number. Like, the more numbers we have, the more we have to work with to build it. So as soon as the numbers show up, we can start shaping it into this network. We're already doing it in a sense. We're just doing I think we can do it on a bigger scale than we're currently doing. But the groundwork is already there with what we're currently doing.
I mean, if we can get this to be in person and like have some real in-person aspect to it in any area, I have a hunch that's going to make the right people gravitate towards us, which in my experience is pretty rare, but at least we would have a better chance, because right now, being kind of stuck with a hyper technologized, isolated structure for doing all of this, I think a lot of people are pushed away from it, because the kind of people we want to be part of community building are demotivated by technology, like, just constant Zoom calls and texting and using Discord and social media. You know, I don't really like social media that much. I mostly don't use it. I find it to be very boring, honestly. And a lot of what I hear about it from as an outsider by friends is this like love-hate relationship that's addictive and miserable. It's like they're addicted to the misery. It's like social media is training them to be masochists. I honestly don't understand it. But it almost makes me wonder if when people, you know, you have the lowest common denominator, you're trying to fill this gap, say you're isolated, what's the lowest common denominator that's filling in the gap for social relationships? And it seems like when people have nothing better to do, they end up arguing and fighting on the internet because maybe it's at least exciting. gives them a rush or something, or they don't have someone to listen to them and they're desperate for being heard and empathy. So if we take this in person and we embrace some of the social awkwardness that other people think they have because they've been isolated a lot, and we just kind of embrace the discomfort, and we like we're the ones to break the ice essentially, and we bring something to people in person that opens up that conversation, that people actually start to have those conflicts out in person, have the uncertainty in person, and even listening and empathy and discovery and realizing, oh, there's a person that actually has these values that I thought didn't exist, and so on and so forth. This is what it's actually like to encounter a person with these values. They're an individual. The way they speak is unique. Their reasoning is different than I thought it would be. We want to uncover what right now is the unknown. And if we can do that in person more, say with this van, the coffee shop van, then it's like it's opening a whole can of worms. It's basically opening Pandora's box if we do this. And I think I would love to do that. I want to open Pandora's box, and a lot of people end up hating me for that.
Well, that's where hope was too, though. You gave me a great idea that we have, I think, enough of us in Washington State already in the Seattle area. We could do a little small scale in-person event with some of us and see how it goes, and we could stream it or like use it as a model, and other people could start doing it in their cities. So I'm going to talk to some of the Washington State CTA people and see if we want to get together maybe in the next few weeks.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. And, the research paper I did last year and a lot of the research I'm building on is about building communities based on self-determination and the third space. And because I'm coming from a youth background a lot of the time, I also emphasized age integration, because part of our isolation right now is that there's this extreme age segregation across, say, the school system, and most kids, their entire lives are in the school system, and there's just not a lot of people that actually intermingle. And so, Jeff, before you dive into that thing, I can give you some of the highlights from my, I guess you could say it has somewhat of a hypothesis, somewhat of a conclusion based on my research. It's building upon that. But say, like, what I noticed was some of the most effective and profound community building programs in my research is that there was a couple of patterns. There's a couple of common building blocks. They were somewhat simple, but they were very specific. And so you create a foundation where people arrive, they land. It's like a landing place. And so your first goal with that is you make it a refuge. So they can arrive. It's a safe place to arrive. And I don't mean safe space the way that some people use it. And it's got this sense of being welcoming and open. So you want to think of how you design the environment. And the regulars help with that because they draw people in. And you want people to be able to let go of their own self-stereotyping. With age segregation, it means that there's this conflict, almost as if there's age-based gangs in a way. A little bit dramatic, but in a youth program, the adults would come in and try to be controlling and kind of condescending because they assume they're better than the younger people. I know better than you. And that just pushes away the younger people and repeats the same problem. So it's just another place where the same issues are happening. To transition away from that, to help people break out of their shell, you give them a shared activity that has some physical component to it. So it takes away the sense of hierarchy. The hierarchy is not always bad, but it helps people get out of their old roles and into something new, where essentially they're just a human being. At this point, they don't know what's going to happen or what their roles are. It's new. And so if everybody's gardening or making food together, it's an activity that allows them to come together. And the physicality of it has a really profound impact. They start to understand the experience and they can actually relax. It's really simple things, but it has this like remarkable impact. And through that shared activity, they actually start to form those relationships.
Something that I'd like
that matches my experience with groups that I've been part of.
I'd like to go back to what you said about social media, Nemo, because I think it's quite commonly recognized that part of how social media functions is originally it's trying to bring you more of what you already like based upon what you express or view or search for, and inherently has a form of confirmation bias, and that confirmation bias and in-group bias that gets formed by what you keep seeing can be very divisive. And so I hear a lot of people talking about the algorithm. We're feeding this algorithm which just keeps dragging us further and further into a one-sided perspective. So there is I think inevitably conflict comes out of that when two groups or two perspectives which have been cemented through confirmation bias and are opposed or different, when they meet, it tends to be conflict that comes out. So you see this particularly in formats like the Twitter format, where it can be quite toxic, or very toxic in fact. And what I'm starting to see now is a kind of a sort of quietly building revolution in social media. So a good example that's coming into the live space now is called SoMe, SOMEE, and SoMe is built on a blockchain. And the reason it functions differently is because you can't control the content in the same way. So there's no central control of content. You can't censor people, deplatform people, etc. But the algorithm, as far as I understand it, is designed on rewarding people for good content and rewarding people for good comment. So it's tokenized. You get an actual reward, not just a kind of a thumbs up, but you get something that has value, potentially monetary value, for producing good content or for positively interacting with it. So it's about, in terms of how social media has functioned and compared to what it can and will maybe function in the future, is to orientate around rewarding positive interaction, not just feeding the negative interaction. So, and SoMe is just one example, but there are others too. But I think it's a really good progression in moving towards, and Lex Fridman talks about this. One of Lex Fridman's desires is to build a form of social media which strengthens compassion, love, and community, and that it is possible. So I have the same tendency with social media. I don't use Facebook anymore. I just deleted my account. I use Twitter for one purpose, and that's just for me to gather information about crypto. Other social medias I barely touch apart from Discord, which I like because it seems to be actually a friendly community. But I'm really excited about the future potential of social media when it shifts into these different patterns of interaction, which develop or support the types of values we've been speaking about today. So I've got my fingers crossed that actually I agree with you about where it is now, but I see where it could and can be going, that it could actually become a healthy platform to connect people that are not physically located near one another.
Yeah.
So I just thought I'd share that because I think it's a really positive thing.
I've watched it do that this past year. I've Zoomed with people from all over the world, classes, workshop, groups. I watched all kind of people come together from everywhere as one giant virtual third place. So it absolutely can happen.
You know what this reminds me of? I had a really close friend a couple of years ago. Her name was Allison, and she had this. We found out independently of each other that we both had a similar idea, and we were focusing on it. We were trying to create it from different angles. And so I showed her, I basically had made this interactive map. Google Maps has a feature where you can, it's called My Maps, I think. You can essentially create a map and you can add little pins, you can color code them, you can add little icons, and you can start to, arrange layers and build up this little map of different places and what they mean to you. And I used that because I wanted a really deeper sense of the youth empowerment-based resources in the cities. And I thought, once I started growing the map, well, why don't I expand to other areas? And so it just kept growing and growing to all these different areas. And then I showed the map to my friend Allison, and she was a pretty high-level self-taught computer programmer that's done some really wild things. And she told me she was literally building a program. So she was building a website from nothing, ground up, to do that exact thing. That would be like this interactive social media that's location based. And so it's whatever area you're in or want to focus on locally, you can find information. It's user populated. So ideally, if a lot of people are using it, then it's going to thrive, especially if they have positive motivations and good values where they want to see it grow into this web. And I realized how remarkable this idea is. She called it resource community. That when you grow this thing through all of these people interacting together of their own, it's decentralized, everyone does it independently. So essentially it is fundamentally self-determined. And that's what a self-determined community would look like. And yet it's specifically localized, it's tied to physicality in the real world. It creates this whole new layer of information on reality. And it's this whole web of information about your local area, resources, quality, real world experiences, changes in their information. So it would be probably much more updated than any other way that people get information before that. It's this really weird subversion of turning internet technology into something that's not global, but is fundamentally localized. And the network then feeds in on itself. And so that's why it creates something entirely new, so that people are interacting with each other that now have new information as the web develops. It's almost self-changing and self-creating. We never got that off the ground. It's kind of a long story, but a couple of years ago, she actually died unexpectedly. So that's the situation, but it's been a while since it happened, but we just never really got that going. I talked to a couple of nonprofits that do coding work and try to make it more affordable, and they thought it was a really, really good idea. I don't have the resources, the people to make it happen, but just the concept of that type of thing, that's subverting things so that we take the technology that's pushing us to be really chaotic and spread thin, and we're not really that connected. Like, we're making the best of things, but there is a reason I want things to be in person. It's limited. And I, among many other people in counterweight related groups, we're really struggling where, if we're lucky, we have our little small crew, and then we have social media or like our, people online we interact with to get through things. But I'm not capable of achieving the things I really want to logistically, because in the real world around me, I'm extremely limited. So I want us to find ways of getting the powerful things and tools we have to actually create those opportunities in the real world.
Yeah.
For some reason, it makes me think about apps that are used by like cyclists and runners in particular. And that might sound like a tangent, but so when I was out cycling with a friend one day, and he said, it popped up on his app on his phone. He said, somebody else has cycled here, and they set out a route from here to another place, and they set out a time that they've achieved it in. Let's see if we can beat it. So it had a little map popped up, it had a route, it had a time, and we tried to beat it. And then he contacted them, and then they met up some other time in the future to try it together. And I know of runners that do this too. They follow each other's running. They don't know each other in person in the beginning. They just follow each other's running, and they cheer each other on, and they support each other in beating their personal bests. And then eventually they meet up and run together. So that, in a way, it starts off virtual, but it has physical location is key to its function. And it can start to bring people into contact with one another around a shared interest, which seems to be a really good way to generate contact and to generate relationship. What excites you? Oh, that excites me too. Oh, you're in the same area. Okay, then maybe there's a safe way that we can discover each other and get to know each other. So I think things like this are starting to emerge, and the Internet of Things is another. Have you heard of this expression, IoT, the Internet of Things? So all of these devices that are able to communicate with each other, from your sat navs to your refrigerator telling you you've run out of milk and ordering more for you, to yeah, I know, right? It's just
I'm
like,
not
there's
looking
so
forward
many
to that.
things.
Oh my God. I do not need a machine babysitting my brain for me. I haven't hard enough time as it is.
But there's this huge wealth of data and information out there that people are kind of sharing, whether they realize it or not, which is driven by devices. And there are aspects of that which can be harnessed in a way to form real community, because it's that people are inadvertently, even like these things like traffic apps, that, you know, if you're driving down the road and you see that there's been a car accident and there's traffic, and you can just report that, and then other car drivers know to avoid that area. So it's live, it's relevant, it's located, it's updated, and it grows. And that kind of resonates with what you were saying. So I think that these things are going to emerge anyway. What would be really cool is like learning about how they can be utilized to bring together, or to create spaces, or bring people together around events, or around ideas, or around needs, and in really healthy ways. So I think it's happening.
It is happening. I keep saying that. I've watched it. And back in the mid 90s, late 90s, AOL came out, America Online, and you get the little CDs in the mail. Everybody was on it. And there was a lot of community forming on there. And I used to host AOL parties, and we'd get together in person. You'd interact online with your screen name, and then you'd meet in person at these AOL parties, and you'd see everybody's screen name, and you get to expand your interaction to the in-person. And it formed, I watched these little communities form from people meeting online on AOL and then getting together in person as the interaction progressed, and having the space to do both. So you had the virtual chat room during the day, and then you had in-person events where you can all meet in person. And it kind of formed, in fact, in Las Vegas, which doesn't really have a gay district, so there's not like a geographical area where the gay people hang out, the chat rooms became the center of gay life in Vegas. So most gay people would interact in the chat room throughout the day, and then they'd go to the bars and see each other at night. So it was this combination of virtual, in-person community. It was very tight-knit and close community. And I don't think it would have happened like it did without having that internet, that virtual component to it. But I guess my whole point of all this was I've been watching these kind of communities form at least since the 90s, in the AOL days, because I remember helping to host some of the parties and get that going.
Yeah, it seems like there's a repeating theme here that, in some cases, people are stuck in a cycle, they're in a rut. In other cases, they're spiraling. So like you come back around to similar things with the same essential pattern, but you're still evolving. And, AOL is a pretty outdated thing as far as these days go, but
in some ways it was a pinnacle. Like in some ways, like they've never duplicated yet what AOL achieved in some ways. I'm still waiting for the next AOL.
Well, I have a hunch that these days, when you find things that are more magical like that, it has to have this sense of being limited rather than global, that maybe access is global or open or whatever, but that something about the way it's set up is attracting people so that it feels like its own local community. So it has a sense of size, that when groups get too large, the group loses its individual identity as a group, and then it just becomes society.
Collective.
Yeah, just like the blob, essentially. And like Counterweight is a good example, and like other Discord groups. I'm not surprised Discord is becoming one of the new big hotshot things. I'm noticing it's almost like we're entering a new era with internet and how people use it, where they want to go back to that sense of real personal connection. that when YouTube first started becoming really big, it like took off and created this sense of focusing on fame. Like you post things on the internet, you want it to be very public, you want your 15 minutes of fame, or you really want to develop something so you become famous. But, or maybe start a business, become independent, whatever it is. But I think now a lot of people are moving back to wanting that sense of it being personal, real relationships. Because if you focus on fame a lot, you might learn the hard way that it doesn't really get you relationships. Most people are strangers. You build a public profile where everything you're investing into relationships is really just fans that are paying attention to you. They don't really know you. Those are not relationships. And so if we're learning the lessons of that era, then we're emphasizing that sense of it being personal. I think that's one of the factors that we're like, when I say in-person or local community or real community, what are some of the factors that define it? And I'm thinking one of those factors is that it's personal. And for it to be personal, it has to be small. That's the essence. You have your family, which is whoever's closest to you, I guess. And then you have your community that's within. And if it's a powerful community that actually has a personal identity, it's alive, and you're intrinsically motivated, then ideally everyone in that community knows each other to some degree, where you would feel comfortable talking with that person and you remember some sense of what's going on in their lives. And everyone gets to have this sense that you're experiencing life together. It's like you're all part of the same story instead of part of your own story where nobody else matters.
Sort of Dunbar's number, isn't it? 150 people is like them seems to have been the maximum functional community size. And whether that needs to remain that way is another question. But certainly, when you get below that number, the sense of having a voice, the sense of the potential of being heard, and the ability to make real relationships, because you get to see the same people over and over and over again. Whereas in broader communities, whether they're cities or they're broad internet communities, you may meet 1,000 different names and faces on a daily basis, and there's no sense of real connection there, apart from, maybe the briefest of, oh, I liked what you said, or you smile at a person in the street as you pass each other. But in those smaller, tighter communities, I think that's what we're talking about there in some way, is the ability to be seen and heard and to matter to others is greater in a smaller community size. And that is something I believe all of us actually really need, whether we know how to express it or not. I think it's a really, really fundamental part to existence, is to be seen, to be heard, to matter, to have value. And to me, that's a really, going back to what I said earlier in terms of trying to respect and honor other people, I think it helps me to look at anyone that I come in contact with, no matter how I'm in relation to them, whether it's in togetherness or opposition, but to recognize that within them is that same need that's in me. I think that actually facilitates much healthier communication. And so for those difficult or more challenging things to uncover, I think you mentioned earlier, Nemo, like uncovering things that are unknown, working through those difficult moments. I think that value of knowing that the other person has something really vulnerable and sensitive and important inside of them about their very existence being recognized actually facilitates being able to do that. So definitely not adults talking down to younger people. That doesn't do that at all. But meeting someone on an equal level requires recognizing in them something that's in you. And there's
that's so basic. Like,
it is, yeah.
Isn't that that happens like sitting on the bus next to the person on the bus, like every human encounter I have starts from that point. I don't even know how to have an encounter that doesn't start from there. I just take that as such a basic
Well,
fundamental
you're our
difference.
shining example, Jeff, aren't you? Like you kind of embody what a lot of people don't even know exists in some ways, but are secretly craving. And I had a bus stop
I don't know if
experience
that's good or
today
not.
just like that. So
You have
I,
me
I s-
thinking though, what you just described about community, I have had my entire life. I grew up in a small Cajun village with about 300 people in it. Everybody knew everybody. And I've moved from environment to environment from there, but they've all been that kind of that scale with those features until I moved to Seattle. This is the first time in my life, and I moved here when I was about 40, that I didn't have that, and I've been miserable for the last 10 years. So I'm sure there's a connection between having that for most of my life and being relatively well adjusted, and then coming here, not having that, having this big impersonal city, and being miserable and my mental health suffering the last 10 years.
I think that probably, I think you probably nailed it there, mate.
Yep, it's tough, and we could even look at some of the reasons that major cities have grown the way that they have, as far as the psychology of it. And so I have, as an example, I have a youth independence guide that I started in 2015. That's when I wrote the original version. I updated it for 2019. So I've been doing this for quite a while now. And I grew up in the suburbs. I don't know almost anything about the area I grew up in because I was hyper sheltered. And in this weirdly contradicting way, that's a very suburban thing. Like, some of the main issues I'm trying to tackle in youth work are more intense in suburbs for some reason. And so being hyper sheltered, then escaping that in this dysfunctional family, and then, going on my hero's journey, you could say, and I ended up in the major cities where I am now, and in the Twin Cities. And I am very much a city guy, despite all of these issues happening and these struggles, and some of the patterns arising that clearly don't meet the needs of people like three of us. And being too generalizing here, but like what Jeff was saying, the comparison he was making. But then with the comparison that you're making, Jeff, about the ways that people struggle in major cities right now, the real lack of community, and also I would say some economic, cultural, political issues, the question is, why are people so drawn to major cities? So many people live here and they stay here, or they move here and they don't want to leave. They gravitate towards it. And I think that one of the examples is why I wrote the youth guide the way I did, is that major cities have a lot of amenities. They have a lot of infrastructure built so that if you're shit out of luck and you're screwed, or you're homeless, or you're really young, you're trying to start your life, going to a major city is one of the best ways you can become self-sufficient. And a lot of people that had really bad, rough, or dysfunctional or abusive experiences wherever they were born, they escape those places and they go to the nearest major city, or they end up on the road and they end up in some city somewhere. Because, there's city buses there, there's transportation. So they're not just stranded in the middle of nowhere as a stranger, or they're not trapped anymore in a small area where their family is dysfunctional and everyone knows each other, and that's what they're stuck with. And so I actually used this metaphor recently, and I've used it for a couple of times over, that a lot of people, they're born into situations that are dysfunctional. Child abuse or just some kind of serious dysfunction in the family is really common. Most of us share that, whether we know it or not. And so we start born into something like that. We struggle with it. And as you get older, you want your independence, your autonomy more and more. The hero's journey is calling, until you hear that calling and you break free and you enter into the adult world. Some people don't quite do that. They just kind of lag along until they're pushed into the adult world. But either way, eventually you're there. And a lot of people just leave behind whatever they were born into. They're like, I want nothing to do with it. I'm going to go out into the wilderness. I'm going out into society. I'm going to find something else. I will see what is out there. I'll get a job and I will take care of myself. And when they do that, it's almost like a mirror is shattered. And these little fragments go in all these different places. And then all these fragments encounter each other. They meet each other. And when you have the fragments coming together, that's when you have the opportunity for them to form something new. Instead of a mirror, maybe it's a mosaic. But when people encounter each other, sometimes it leads to conflict rather than that new community. So I think that's a way of defining the essential problem we're facing right now.
But conflict, I don't think it's either or. I think conflict is part of community, and having like, I think one of our strengths and our advantages, especially coming since so many of us are from the mental health community, is having conflict resolution techniques that work. So as long as we have healthy conflict resolution techniques or a means for resolving the conflict, I don't think it's a choice between having community or conflict. You can have both. And I think they probably help each other out in the long run.
Well, I agree
That's
with
what
that,
liberalism
actually.
is, isn't it?
Like,
What,
I think
Neil?
there's healthy conflict that can be transformative, that can lead to the larger health of the community.
I was going to say that I remember reading an article recently talking about liberalism as an ideology, like classical liberalism as an ideology, and then I read a kind of rebuttal to it that said that liberalism isn't an ideology; it's a system of conflict resolution. At least the classical humanistic liberalism, that it doesn't seek to set out an end goal and say this is how things should be. It wishes to provide a marketplace of ideas where people can bring difference and rationally, as rationally as possible, share their ideas, accept challenges, revise their ideas where they, test them out, see whether other people agree, see whether their ideas are solid or not, and when they're not, amend them, development, keep going. And so a lot of the progression in civil rights and social justice, traditionally speaking, has come from the application of conflict resolution. It's actually been a process of conflict resolution. And that's what classical liberalism provides, a system to resolve conflict and difference. And that doesn't always have to end up in 100% agreement or a single way of doing things, but allows for difference to coexist in a much healthier way, which I think is really fundamental because we're all pretty different. One of the things about cities, which is really interesting, is that there's been loads of studies done on cities and asking that same question: why do they exist? Why do people get drawn to them? And in every city in the world, there is a relationship between its size and the amount of economic reward that can be achieved by living there. And as cities grow, the proportion of economic reward increases. So it becomes, that's why like city wages tend to be greater than rural wages for the same work. There's a function within, a mathematical function within the existence of large scale, which lends to that. And that's why it's possible to have, 57 different sushi restaurants in the same city and they can all survive. It's just the sheer scale of it allows for that to happen. And one thing that as you were speaking, Nemo, made me think also, the other thing that cities can provide or do provide is anonymity for people that are seeking it. So where we may be talking about seeking community, some people actually, before they can do that, need to seek anonymity. They need to escape from maybe that environment where they're utterly known, but that environment's been toxic, and in somehow maybe resolve how that's impacted them and reinvent themselves before they can find a community that to discover who they are actually underneath all of that nonsense, so that then I can say, oh, this is who I am. The anonymity has provided me a space to reinvent and rediscover or discover self. Now I can go out and seek people that may be similar, and where better to do that than in a place where there's 10 million people. There's a much higher chance that I'm going to find 10 in 10 million here than I am in the town of 700 I just left, where I know everyone and I don't like them, or I'm too different to fit into their way. So I think there's this really interesting dynamic. It can be isolating, it can provide anonymity, but it can also provide connection. But the sheer scale of it provides opportunity, and at the same time, the sheer scale of it limits the ability to form like really good communities unless you're very active in doing so. So that's just some thoughts on the complexities of cities.
Well, hopefully we can make it a little easier for people now. If we have this
Yeah,
virtual third space, they won't be in the city struggling alone to form a community. They have this to kind of mediate between whatever they're struggling to do on the ground, and they can use us in the meantime.
In
and I love to bring those heterodox values to that. The lack of echo chamber, that kind of the lack of confirmation bias that I recognize in social media. I think one really important thing for healthy communities is, for me anyway, and I doesn't mean everyone's going to agree, but for me, one of the things that's really healthy in those communities is difference side by side. Like for that to be okay, to be welcome. Because when you bring difference together in a way that it can coexist, you get real creative energy. New things come from, I think new things come less from confirmation bias and more from kind of not necessarily conflict, but the meeting of differences anyway.
Yeah.
And that's a really exciting space.
Yeah. Neil, when you say anonymity, I actually think of isolation. I've saw this pattern for quite a while in my work, that when a person wants to escape a dysfunctional situation, usually it's their family they're born into, because that's where they start. Nobody chooses it. Usually it's better to be willing to leave behind the abuse, these dysfunctional relationships, and embrace isolation, because that's like embracing the blank page that allows you to start something totally new. And so it opens up the space for your autonomy. And so I tend to say, if people have really bad relationships, instead of those relationships being anything of service to them, it tends to be a detriment against everything else, no matter what. And a lot of people don't want to give that up because they're afraid of embracing the blank page or starting over. They're actually afraid of, in a way, their own vulnerability, which is actually, it's already there, but they don't feel it as much because of the rigidity of their dysfunctional relationships that feel like a prison. So life feels really rigid and stuck. And it's like they get used to that and almost want to embrace it. There's this kind of dependence on it. And so there's a fear of, or resistance to, embracing your own vulnerability, embracing that isolation so that you can discover that autonomy, because it can be really painful. And that's a frustration I have with some of the ways self-help culture has evolved, where people want to present healing as something that always feels good. And sometimes it does not. Like, a personal evolution can be really painful.
Yeah, I'm looking to embrace that at the moment. I'm looking for experiences that are sort of contained and curated, but actually put you in touch with the really sort of painful stuff that you don't want to deal with. Because I know there's stuff inside of me that I can't even name because I don't know what it is, but I know that it's there. Sometimes it feels like a sort of empty space or a dark space or something behind a wall that I know that I kind of semi-consciously avoid. So I'm looking for those types of experiences where you go, okay, now you're going to meet it and uncover what that is. Because a lot of healing is very, very painful. But that's okay. For me, at least, that's okay. And so for me, the sort of dysfunctional elements of history, my history, that may have put me to, I want to escape from, or have created these, at some point, I hope to be able to see them as being of service to me, in that I may never have gone off and discovered myself if it wasn't for the fact that there was a kind of kick in the ass that was so painful that I was like, I need to get out of here and discover myself, because this place isn't doing it for me anymore. Like, in some ways, perhaps that can be seen, for me at least, as being the rather painful but useful starting point of self-discovery. is actually, you know, if things are really sort of super comfortable, then there isn't much need to go and discover yourself. So there's a different way to look at it, but not that I wish those experiences upon anybody, but when they happen, it's about, for me, it's about how do you respond to it, and though your response to it could actually be the pathway to strength and self-determination. So, but I still don't wish it upon anyone. It's a bit of a contradiction, isn't it? I hope that never happens to you, but if it does, hopefully that leads you to discovering yourself and something far greater than what's happening before. Yeah, we'll see.
I think it makes sense.
We'll see. Yeah.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, usually painful and difficult or challenging things teach people, especially if they're open to the learning. It's very powerful, but you wouldn't want to manufacture it, because then you're just torturing someone.
Yeah, exactly. Far from it. You want to do everything you can to reduce that for people, you know. But it happens, and it's almost inevitable that it does happen. So what do you do with it?
Yeah, well, I've certainly been through the ringer the last couple of months with this van, and you know, with the kind of person I am, that's how I respond to those situations. I'm really good at improvising. I'm not very good at routine, and I'm really good at those kind of risky things, big adventures, and it's definitely a really significant learning experience, especially just to travel and get somewhere new that I don't really know at all. And I'm not there on vacation, so I'm not led to all the touristy areas. So I'm getting a very real experience of what the area is. And the tourist aspect doesn't buffer it, which touristy stuff tends to buffer things because it's very similar in a lot of places, or it's just a very limited type of experience. But I'm getting the kind of, I'm stranded in this random place. I don't know what's really going on around here. And I'm just talking to people because I'm stuck here for a while. And it's great. In a way, it's actually fundamentally wonderful. And it really made it pretty clear to me just how hyper politicized the Twin Cities is in this really nasty, toxic way. Because being
into the wild, isn't it? You enter the wild and embrace the chaos, and then you discover a new world.
Ta-da! Yeah, well, I knew this was a thing. Like I've understood some of this stuff for a while, but it's really good to get experiences that continue to take you out of your element, because then you constantly have that comparison, and it really emphasized it. Like I got the sense that some of the people I interacted with would have no idea what I was describing. A lot of the issues I faced would be completely foreign to them. It would be so hard for them to understand why it's an issue, which is kind of funny because Jeff sometimes has that reaction. I wonder if maybe that goes back to his small town Cajun roots.
Because I'm country. I have that reaction. I'm from the dirt. It's true. What reaction are you talking about? That I wouldn't understand your issues.
Well, I mean, we weren't going to talk about, social justice today, so I'll kind of briefly reference something and try and bring it into the core of the essence here. But, oftentimes it's when somebody is like deeply offended by something, supposedly they're deeply offended. I don't know, here's an example. A couple of years ago, there was a Cheerios commercial. There was an interracial couple and they had a daughter, and it was just about Cheerios and family time. And a bunch of social justice proponents thought that the commercial was racist for some reason, I guess because the couple's interracial. I don't understand myself, but I have a hunch that you would be completely baffled by it as well. But a bunch of people were really offended by it for some reason.
Yeah, no, I don't understand.
I can't even
That's
explain
what you mean.
one.
No, I don't understand what people are offended by.
Okay, so I'm trying to remember too. I think maybe their claim was that it's tokenism. So
I don't understand offensive. I'm a Satanist. I don't care if I offend you. The belief in personal freedom is one of our tenets, including the freedom to offend. So the fact that being offended gives you the right to do something or like get something in consequence of, I don't care about your offense. I don't care if I offend you or if something is offensive to you. Um, so that's one. I don't even. That's one reason I don't understand it is because I don't even take it seriously in the first place. That they're offended by a black and white couple eating Cheerios. I wouldn't care. Like just as a Satanist, I can't care about that. I don't have the psychology to even care that somebody's offended by me. So I think that might be a barrier even more than being from this country.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it does. The more my life continues, I mean, didn't I say earlier today? I don't know if we were live when I said this or not. I don't even remember, but I said that as my life continues, it feels like there's an increase in entropy. The roller coaster is getting more chaotic and unpredictable as it continues. I really think that most of life is incredibly absurd. The life that I have lived, the way I look around at things, it is remarkably absurd. And I think way too many people forget or don't consider how none of it makes any sense. Like just the idea that most people I meet, they act as if they can predict the future. They act as if they plan things out and all right, that's the plan.
Some of
Done
them
deal.
do. It
Yeah,
amazes me.
yeah, and the reality is completely but if you point it out to people, I don't think they would necessarily say I can predict the future. They would say, "Huh?" And they say, "Well, I make plans and I do my best." But I really think most people default to life being more reliable than it is. And if you really want to go radical, you could say nothing is predictable. We just have a general idea and everything just happens spontaneously.
Yeah,
And
that
we
makes more sense. That's how I live my life more. Like when I leave the house every day, I'm more in that world that you just described.
Yeah. Like I make plans, but I don't expect that they're going to go according to plan.
I
I just got back
never.
from,
I have no concept of the future. I don't even know what the future looks like. And every single time I try to plan something, it never turns out like a plan. So I have stopped trying to plan probably since childhood. And I don't know. The future is just like this big blank spot. I don't even have any. I don't. People that can plan for the future amaze me. I don't know how they're doing it. I don't know what they're seeing when they look at the future and how they're getting from here to make it be like what they have in their head. All that just blows my mind. I've never been able to do that.
well, yeah, so then maybe that's another reason something doesn't make sense to you is that most people I encounter, I think it's because there's a lot that's mundane or routine. That's just kind of the default. And a lot of people I mean, this is my perception because I'm often this outsider and I guess I'm living, I don't know, differently than people. But when I look around at people that I encounter, a lot of them live very similar lives. Like they pursue something that's almost cookie cutter. Like I'm going to get my morning coffee, I'm going to get it overpriced at Starbucks or whatever and be a caffeine addict and there's going to be too much sugar in it and I'm going to go to my job and it's probably 9 to 5 or 8 to 4 or whatever. And then I'm going to try and make it to the bank before they close because I'm a normie and the banks have the same hours as my job. None of this makes any sense to me. And it's like, and I'm going to get married to some random person I meet. I'm like, I guess they're good enough. And we're going to have some kids and none of it makes sense to me. Like, why do people want to just live this default life where they're just not even thinking about it? I'm just going to do this. I'm going to go for that. And then it makes perfect sense to me why people end up miserable because they don't spend any time actually being contemplative or creative or considering what do I actually want for my life? What do I want to accomplish? What's something that's meaningful to me? They don't really consider that. They just go with this cookie cutter route. And of course, it's not going to turn out that way because their plans are so incredibly narrow. There's no room for the unpredictableness and the uniqueness of their own life. And so when things don't go according to this nonsense plan that's not even thought through at all, it's they become miserable and they go through this and a lot of people almost go through this existential crisis. And like if you look at some of the late 90s movies like Fight Club or The Matrix,
Oh, I love Fight Club.
I think that those movies kind of represent that disillusionment of people waking up to whatever I thought I was supposed to do doesn't make any sense. And it's just a strange thing to me that a lot of people are on autopilot. I don't understand what leads them to be on autopilot and just assume that's how it's going to be. That doesn't make any sense.
I cannot
what
wait
I'm
for our
hearing
road
is like,
trip.
I was gonna say what I'm hearing is people need validating, right? And the best place to validate oneself is through oneself, i.e. self-validation. But most of us are socialized from childhood into adulthood to seek validation from those around us. Broadly speaking, society, but at least family and friends. Most people are raised that way. Not everyone, but many. And the simplest route to validation from others is to do what's expected. And what is expected is generally dictated in a broader sense by social norms and social needs. So getting the job, turning up, drinking the coffee, watching the same TV show, having the kids, driving the car, getting the latest phone, whatever. I think most of that is the pursuit of validation by others, or at least acceptance. And self-discovery and meaning and discovering one's own meaningful journey requires you to validate yourself. It requires you to say, this is what's right for me, and I don't really need anyone else to tell me whether that's right or wrong. That's what I mean by validation. So I think the process of socialization is a process of indoctrination into check that everyone else says you're okay. And the easiest way to do that is to follow this set of rules. These set of rules are not actually designed for you to be you. They're designed for you to function within a larger group, which broadly speaking serves the purpose of keeping an economy running and a society kind of, well, quite frankly, poorly functioning rather than healthily functioning. And that's why when I see a lot of people, that there's a lot of sort of slight look of fear in their eyes when they're living their lives. Like they're kind of scared of getting things wrong for the main part. I mean, we're seeing a change in that now. We're seeing quite a sort of a separation, but even then, what I see in terms of a political separation in society is one group of people validating themselves, or each other rather, and then another group in opposition validating themselves and each other, and a lot of dishonesty. Like I really don't see a lot of honesty in it, or a lot of individualism in it. It's just kind of groupthink. Yes, groupthink validates me. I'm part of the group. That's great. And people just take on ideas without thought, without reflection, without them being meaningful. But because it situates them, it gives them credibility within their group. And that comes from a need to find credibility from others rather than from ourselves. Jeff, one of the reasons I love Jeff so much is he's like almost pure individualism. Jeff is Jeff, not really interested in whether anyone else, like the whole thing about, if I'm going to offend you, then fuck it, I'm going to offend you. And there's an expression, but not an expression, there's a Socratic philosopher, Epictetus, who said that if someone succeeds in provoking you, be aware that your mind is complicit in that provocation.
Yeah,
So
I come from the school, like growing up in therapy and everything, they taught us that you're responsible for your feelings. Like nobody makes you cry. Nobody makes you angry. You have to take ownership of your own feelings. So I assume if somebody's feeling something, that's happening inside of them, and they can take care of that themselves. I'm not causing Plus, growing up gay, you got that all the time. You were offensive. You were constantly, just your very existence was offending people. If I took the time to care about that, I would never get to live my life and be myself. So you just kind of learn that that's just the price of. And I was thinking as you were talking the whole time how that it must be cultural or something, because I don't relate to anything you're saying. No. Like need validation from other people, and like it's so foreign to me that.
Yeah.
Absolutely, I can see.
And probably some of it's the autism, but some of it's probably growing up. I grew up in these like very, what do I want to say? I was diagnosed gifted in the first grade. I was put in these very specialized education environments. So I was always like separated from the group on the outside looking in. So I never grew up in the group knowing what their expectations are, what the group psychology was. I was always in my own little environment, looking at the group from afar, working off of very different values and expectations and norms that were appropriate for my nervous system. So like I never had this like group experience to begin with, but it didn't really look like the people around me were. My family's pretty individualistic. Like we all pretty much do our own thing. We're very strong-willed. We have strong opinions, and so it looked to me like everybody was doing their own thing because they wanted to. And when I look at people, and I never get this right, and I'm not going to get it right now, I assume that people are doing exactly what they want to do in the moment because they're getting fulfilled by it or there's some kind of payoff for it, but they are following their bliss and they're doing what they want because that's what I'm doing all the time. And so I never think people are doing it because they're conditioned to or because they're doing it for validation. I assume if someone's doing something, it's because they want to be, that's what they want to be doing in that moment, or they wouldn't be doing it.
Well, that would be lovely if that were the case. I think if it were the case and we had ways of respecting that for each other, we'd be living in a very different world. So I think that's the goal, right? That's the thing to aim for and to build and share and enable for others is just the ability to do that.
Yeah. Like I said, I've had that most of my life, so I'll recognize it when it's happening, and I'm help any way I can to keep it going because that's the environment that I need to be in.
That's fantastic.
Yes. Yeah, that would be really beautiful. I mean, Jeff, I think what you're describing, it's almost like you have a built-in lens to view people as self-determined. Like the reason self-determination theory was discovered was an accident. The researchers were trying to research what causes intrinsic motivation. There's intrinsic motivation that's coming from within. It's like the fire is ignited. There's passion. It's inward. It's driven from the inside out. So when they were researching that, it's almost like they weren't that far off from trying to figure out what animates and brings a person to life altogether. It was this almost crazy, mysterious thing to research. It's actually something very special. And Jeff, I think me and you have always, and probably Neil, I wouldn't be surprised if he's like us too. We've almost always been driven intrinsically from the inside out. Yeah. And for me, I've often also spent my time being sort of an outsider. It's not necessarily always that I'm ostracized or isolated. It's just that I'm always different. And I think the intrinsic motivation factor is a big piece. And some of this can be a catch-22, and that people will make decisions. If they're apathetic or lacking motivation, they'll make decisions that perpetuate that continue to create a life that's not very motivating. And then the opposite is also true. If you are putting in the effort, then you're going to create a life that's actually motivating to you. And so a lot of my work in the last couple of years has been trying to find ways to unlock these paradoxes so that people can ignite that initial spark and they gain that momentum, where then the fire is ignited inside so they actually can begin to see and create and make real the life that is motivating to them. And I'm actually reading a book right now. It's called Answers Behind the Red Door by Michelle Steeb. She is pretty much, I would say, ruthlessly criticizing something called Housing First. It's this national movement across the US. It's a huge disaster. It's behind a lot of the problems I've been talking about with the homeless issues. And that it's basically institutionalizing this low barrier requirement that people if you're a program that wants to help homeless people gain housing, all you can do is provide housing. You cannot require them to maintain a job, get out of an addiction, overcome issues with anger, psychological issues and so on. All you do is give them housing. So everything she is talking about is exposing that and people's need for sparking that intrinsic motivation. That's the hero's journey, is igniting that fire. And I wonder, Jeff, if maybe part of your struggle is you've not had the experience of lacking that intrinsic motivation, or at least not much. So maybe
I've never not had intrinsic motivation. I think everybody is kind of internally propelled, and I've had very, very little, almost zero extrinsic motivation. Like I've never been in environments where there's been a lot of, and I've always avoided them. I'm highly sensitive to authoritarianism, so if I detect just a whiff of it in the air, I'm gonna avoid that environment. So I've somehow evaded. I've had a much less ratio of extrinsic motivation and a much higher proportion of internal. And to me, that just seems like babies are intrinsically motivated when they're like the extrinsic comes from social conditioning and engineering and all that, but intrinsically humans are just naturally motivated. So I take that as the baseline of people's psychology much more than I do the social conditioning and the
yeah.
external psychological reasons they would do something. That's almost invisible to me.
Yeah.
Well, we
Neil,
are coming up on our hour, and
yeah.
it's been a great show so far.
Yeah, I think this has been one of our best episodes. I got back from an utterly chaotic part 2 of a disaster, and I guess I just landed here, whoop, and here we are, I guess. One last thing I want to tack on to the end of your thing there, Jeff. I think when people like myself and say you and Neil, typically when we experience an attempt at an extrinsic motivation, so essentially manipulation from another person, use of fear or demands or bullying or I'm offended, things like that. For us, at least this is my experience, it's not extrinsic motivation. All it is demotivating. So I'm not susceptible to extrinsic motivation because I never had that pattern developed. So all they're doing is interrupting and trying to interfere with my intrinsic motivation. And an essential part of intrinsic motivation is autonomy. So if you're making demands of me or bullying me, then I'm just disinterested in interacting with you. And so we have different reactions than people who may have had their early development affected, who are probably way different in their reactions than us.
Yeah. I tell all my employers, like, if you want me to do something, tell me what you want me to do, and I'll do it. Don't try to manipulate me or force me, or just enlist my cooperation, and you're going to get the best out of me that way. Just explain what you want me to do, and let's collaborate on me doing it. Because I know the manipulation when it's happening, and it throws me off, exactly like you said. It's that autonomy that I need.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, I guess we'll see each other again in a week. And in the meantime, we have the Discord, we have the weekly Zoom, and probably other stuff sprinkled in here and there.
Are you guys hanging out on the back porch now?
Yeah, I'm headed there now, and we actually have our gaming group that meets tonight in about an hour, so we're going to be doing that. And
I am tired I was on the road and just in utter chaos. I'm pretty tired. So I think I'm literally going to just fall asleep. But I'm glad I was actually able to make this episode. That was some good news that came out of this van disaster. And stay tuned, folks. Someday, if you can help us get there, whoever's might actually be watching, we will have the van coffee shop on the road.
Yeah, coming to a town near you soon.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I guess we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Have a good week.